All right, let's take a look at the stomach. Described as a J-shaped pouch-like organ, 25 to 30 centimeters long, that's 10, 12 inches, hanging inferior to, below the diaphragm in the upper left portion of the abdominal cavity. It has a capacity of about a liter or more. Inner lining has thick gastric folds known as rugae of the mucosal and submucosal layers that unfold when the wall is distended, in other words, stretched out when you fill it up with food. The stomach receives food from the esophagus. It mixes it with gastric juice. It initiates digestion of proteins. It carries on limited absorption, and then it moves food into the small intestine. In addition to the muscularis externa, 2 layers of smooth muscle that you find throughout the alimentary canal. Some parts of the stomach have an extra layer that is oblique, in other words, angled. This third innermost muscular layer, which is most highly developed near the opening of the esophagus and in the body of the stomach, strengthens the wall and contributes to the mixing and churning actions. We have already seen the sections of the stomach being named the cardia, which is the small area near the esophageal opening, the fundus, which is the dome top. They mention here that it will sometimes fill up with swallowed air to produce an air bubble that you can see in an x-ray. The body is the main part of the stomach between the fundus and the pylorus. The pylorus is the far end, the distal portion of the stomach as it approaches the small intestine. The pyloric antrum is a funnel-shaped portion that narrows down and becomes the pyloric canal as it approaches the small intestine. At the end of the pyloric canal, there's a thickening in the circular layer of the smooth muscle to form the powerful pyloric sphincter. And again, sphincters are like muscular valves that are normally closed. Here is that x-ray picture, and this bright white area is the fundus of the stomach. And it will show up that way because of an air pocket in it. All right. Let's talk about the gastric secretions. The mucous membrane or mucosa forming the inner layer of the stomach is thick. The surface is studded with small openings called gastric pits, which are at the ends of tubular gastric glands. Lining of the stomach mucosa is simple columnar epithelium with many mucus cells near the surface. These cells produce an alkaline mucus to coat and protect the inner stomach lining from the acidic conditions, which you've probably heard of, stomach acid, and from protein digesting enzymes to keep the stomach from digesting itself. We'll be talking about these here in a minute: parietal cells, chief cells, and enteroendocrine cells. Here we can see the gastric pits, and if we do this zoom in here, here's the gastric pit, and as we come down into it, we find gastric glands, parietal cells, chief cells, and enteroendocrine cells, and they've kind of color-coded all of those. All right, so as we move on, we'll see what each of those are about. Although the structure and composition of the secretions will vary in different parts of the stomach, the gastric glands generally contain 4 types of secretory cells. The mucous neck cells in the necks of the glands near the opening of the gastric pits secrete, not surprisingly, mucus. And remember, mucus secreting cells are goblet cells. The other types, chief cells, parietal cells, and enteroendocrine cells, are in the deeper parts of the glands. Chief cells secrete digestive enzymes. Parietal cells secrete a solution that contains hydrochloric acid, that is the stomach acid. The secretions from the mucous cells, the chief cells, the parietal cells mix together and form gastric juice. The enteroendocrine cells secrete chemical messengers important in regulating digestion. Some of these are hormones that will travel in blood to target cells. Others act locally and are considered paracrine secretions. And that takes us back to some things we talked about back in chapter 13. The most important of the digestive enzymes in gastric juice is one called pepsin. Chief cells secrete pepsin in the form of an inactive, non-erosive enzyme precursor. Well, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Called pepsinogen. Now, I have mentioned previously that when you see the suffix ogen, it means that it can become, you can think of the term, it can create, because ogen, as in Genesis, in the Bible, the story of creation. So it will create or become whatever is in front of the suffix ogen. So in this case, pepsinogen will become pepsin. Now, the trigger to cause that change, when pepsinogen comes in contact with hydrochloric acid from the parietal cells, it breaks down rapidly and forms an active enzyme called pepsin. Now, let me give you an analogy here. So, certain things that we buy, one thing that comes to mind, I've seen this before. Many years ago, I worked in an appliance store. And when someone bought a new washing machine, the tub of the washing machine was bolted down to keep it from moving during transport. And when you delivered and set the washing machine up, you had to remove that bolt so that the tub could move and the clothing in it could get clean. So that's kind of like pepsinogen and pepsin. And what I mean by that is pepsinogen has the bolt. Okay, remember that enzymes like pepsin are proteins. And pepsinogen is pepsin, but with some extra amino acids that render it inactive. It doesn't do anything. If you remove those extra amino acids, you form the active protein, which is pepsin. So hydrochloric acid causes those extra amino acids to come off. It's like taking the bolt out of the washing machine so that the tub can move. I also want to point something out here that I probably should have already. I'm sure you've heard of pH. pH being a measure telling you whether something is acid or base. And acids like hydrochloric acid tend to lower pH. pHs below 7 are acid. So one way to remember that it's the parietal cells that secrete the hydrochloric acid is P parietal, H hydrochloric. So pH. Parietal cells make hydrochloric acid to lower the pH. All right. Now, pepsin then, once it's activated, can break down more pepsinogen to create even more pepsin. And they call that an autocatalytic effect. Catalysts speed up conversions, speed up chemical reactions. Auto means self. So once you activate some of the pepsinogen, turn it into pepsin, that pepsin then turns around and self-activates more pepsinogen. So pepsin begins the digestion of nearly all types of dietary protein into polypeptides. It's most active in an acidic environment, which you have because of the hydrochloric acid that's there. Okay, so dietary protein. Remember that proteins are made of, they are chains of amino acids, and pepsin will start breaking those chains apart into smaller polypeptides. Gastric juice contains small quantities of a fat-splitting enzyme called gastric lipase, but its action is inhibited somewhat by the low pH. They don't say it here. Traditionally, this book has mentioned that gastric lipase mainly works on only one type of lipid, and that is butterfat. I notice they've stopped saying that in this edition of the book. Yet another component found in gastric juice is something called intrinsic factor. Now, this also comes from the parietal cells. Remember that they make hydrochloric acid. Intrinsic factor is necessary for absorbing vitamin B12. And vitamin B12 is very important in proper formation of red blood cells. Interesting note is that if you take things that slow down stomach acid production, things like the histamine blockers like Pepcid and Zantac, or the proton pump inhibitors, the more modern things like, of course my mind goes blank, Prevacid, not Tagamet, that's one of the older ones, Protonix. When they inhibit the parietal cells from making hydrochloric acid so you don't get heartburn, they also inhibit production of intrinsic factor. And that can lead to issues absorbing vitamin B12, and that can lead to pernicious anemia where you're not properly forming your red blood cells. All right, let's see. Regulation of gastric secretions. I normally don't spend very much time on this. They do mention a hormone called gastrin that increases secretory activity of gastric glands. Again, that's another hormone that we didn't talk about in the hormone chapter. But I want to point out right here, gastrin comes from gastric glands, which means your stomach is making hormones. That means your stomach is an endocrine gland. It's not one of the major endocrine glands that we looked at in chapter 13. But you will see over and over things that make hormones that were not in that chapter. Gastrin stimulates cell division in the mucosa of the stomach and intestines, replaces cells damaged by normal organ function, disease, medical treatment. Parasympathetic impulses with gastrin promote the release of paracrine secretion called histamine. Histamine stimulates additional gastric secretion. That's why histamine blockers like Tagamet and Pepcid help reduce acid production. Let's see. Don't want to say too much about this either. Gastric secretion occurs in 3 stages called the cephalic, the gastric, and the intestinal phase. The cephalic phase, again, you should know that cephalic means head, begins before food ever reaches the stomach and maybe even before you eat. Parasympathetic reflexes operating through the vagus nerve stimulate gastric secretion at the taste, smell, sight, or thought of food. So when you're thinking about food with your head, when you see food with the eyes in your head, when you smell food with the olfactories in your head, you go ahead and start secreting some gastric juice at that point. The gastric phase, as the name implies, is when food actually enters the stomach, and most of the secretion happens. It starts when food enters the stomach. Presence of food and stretching the stomach wall, or distending it, as they like to say, triggers the stomach to release gastrin, and that stimulates production of more gastric juice. pH in the stomach can get down around 3. And when it gets that low, that is the signal to stop secreting gastrin. And when it gets down to 1.5, the gastrin secretion will completely stop. Let's see. I'm going to talk later about hydrogen ions and chloride ions. We'll worry about that later. The third phase of gastric secretion is the intestinal phase. Once the food has been pushed out of the stomach in the form of chyme into the small intestine and the intestinal wall is stretched, intestinal cells will release another hormone called intestinal gastrin. Notice that it's intestinal cells releasing a hormone, which means the intestines are an endocrine gland, and that will briefly enhance gastric gland secretion. And that kind of means you get a little wave of gastric juice as the stomach is emptied. It sort of helps rinse it out. But the intestinal phase primarily inhibits gastric juice secretion. Now here we get first mention of another hormone called cholecystokinin. So partially digested proteins and fats in the duodenum, in other words, right when the food exits the stomach into the small intestine, releases this peptide hormone called cholecystokinin. And we're going to see this 2 or 3 times here. It acts on the stomach wall to decrease gastric motility. So that is just one of the functions of cholecystokinin. It basically says to the stomach, look, you're empty now, calm down, stop wiggling around, stop squeezing, stop secreting gastric juice. Let's see. As far as gastric absorption, the stomach wall is not well adapted to absorb digestive product. The stomach absorbs only small volumes of water and certain salts and certain lipid-soluble drugs. Most nutrients get absorbed in the small intestine. Alcohol, which is not considered a nutrient, is also absorbed in both the small intestine and the stomach. They say it's not a nutrient, but it does have calories. So you could make an argument about that. Let's see, mixing, emptying actions. I don't usually say much about this. Here is the mention of chyme. Producing a semi-fluid paste of food particles and gastric juice, which is called chyme. I wouldn't call it food anymore at that point because, I mean, if it came back up, you wouldn't want to eat it. So chyme is food that has been mixed with gastric juice in the stomach and it goes out into the small intestine. Let's see. Enterogastric reflex is presence of partially digested fat and chyme stimulates sensory receptors in the intestinal wall to trigger the enterogastric reflex. Let's see. Don't need to really do any more about that now. Cheerful thought here, vomiting. Results from a complex reflex emptying the stomach in the reverse order can be triggered by certain drugs, which are called emetics. Things that stop you from wanting to vomit then are called antiemetics. There could be toxins in contaminated food. If the stomach gets overstretched or distended, if there are rapid changes in body motion, sensory impulses from the labyrinths of the inner ears. So if you get spun around a lot, that can cause a vomiting reflex. Let's see. Nausea emanates from activity in the vomiting center or in nerve centers near it. Stomach movements usually are diminished or absent. Duodenal contents may move back into the stomach. So nausea is just that feeling of sickness. Okay. At nearly just over 19 minutes here, I believe that's a good stopping point. The next section will take a little bit of time too, so we'll stop our stomach tour right here.